The Pacific skies roared with the thunder of radial engines as the heat of battle between American and Japanese forces grew more ferocious with every passing month. For a young man named Kenneth Walsh, the war offered no glamour or pause for reflection, only duty, instinct, and raw survival. Born on November 24, 1916, in Brooklyn, New York, Walsh grew up during a time of sweeping global change. From an early age, he was fascinated by flight. The spirit of aviation stirred in him something fierce, and that passion would soon translate into a life marked by extraordinary achievement in the United States Marine Corps. In 1933, long before America would be dragged into a global conflict, Kenneth Walsh enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps as a young man with a dream. Initially a mechanic, he quickly displayed a mechanical aptitude and work ethic that set him apart. But turning wrenches wasn't enough for Walsh. He aspired to be in the cockpit, to control the machines he helped maintain. His perseverance led him to aviation training, and in 1937, he earned his wings as a naval aviation pilot, one of the few non-commissioned officers to become a designated combat pilot before the war. By the time Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Walsh was already a seasoned flyer with hundreds of hours under his belt. As the United States plunged into the Pacific War, he joined Marine Fighting Squadron 124, VMF 124, the first Marine squadron to fly the powerful Vought F-4U Corsair. This aircraft, with its distinctive gull wings and blistering speed, would become a deadly extension of Walsh's will. The Corsair was challenging to fly and land, particularly on aircraft carriers, but in the hands of a skilled pilot like Walsh, it was a predator in the sky. Walsh's combat record began to form in early 1943 as VMF 124 deployed to the Solomon Islands. He was among the first Marine pilots to bring the Corsair into combat. The Solomons were a fierce battleground where the Japanese still held formidable air superiority. Dogfights over the jungled islands and open sea were daily affairs, and American pilots had to be quick, aggressive, and merciless. Walsh was all of these things. His first kills came in April 1943, and from there, the count began to rise. His engagement style was methodical yet daring. He would often climb to altitude ahead of enemy bombers, allowing himself to dive with the Corsair's high speed and firepower to shatter enemy formations. He became known for precision, rarely wasting ammunition and always prioritizing survival over showmanship. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Walsh did not see glory in reckless heroism. He flew to win and lived to fly again. By mid-1943, he had already achieved ace status, having shot down 5 Japanese planes. But Walsh wasn't finished. In one especially brutal series of engagements, he downed multiple aircraft in a single mission. On August 15, 1943, flying over the Vella La Vella area, Walsh was credited with 4 kills in a single day, an achievement that not only boosted his tally but left Japanese pilots rattled by the ferocity of the Marine Corsairs. Time and again, he would return from missions with his aircraft riddled with bullet holes, his oxygen system damaged, or his controls barely functional. Yet he always brought the Corsair back, landing with nerves of steel. His courage was tested to the limit on August 30, 1943. Assigned to escort bombers over the heavily defended Kahili airfield in Bougainville, Walsh led a flight of Corsairs deep into enemy territory. There, they encountered overwhelming numbers of Japanese Zeros and bombers. Despite the odds, Walsh pressed the attack. Diving into the melee, he downed 3 Japanese planes before his aircraft was hit. He bailed out over the ocean and spent hours in the water before being rescued. His bravery that day earned him the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. Walsh's award citation detailed how he displayed extraordinary heroism and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. But for the pilot himself, it was simply another day of war, a brutal calculation of risk and resolve. His fellow Marines saw him as a steady leader, a man who rarely raised his voice, but whose presence in the air calmed even the greenest pilots. His instincts were sharp, and his ability to read an enemy's move often meant the difference between life and death for the men flying beside him. Throughout 1943 and 1944, Walsh continued to fly combat missions across the Pacific. As newer pilots rotated into the squadrons, Walsh became a mentor. He emphasized gunnery, flight discipline, and teamwork. He believed in the machine but more so in the man behind the controls. Many of his protégés would go on to have successful combat records, citing his training as crucial. By the time his combat tours ended, Kenneth Walsh had recorded 21 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of the top Marine Corps aces of the war. His kills included both fighters and bombers, often under harsh conditions and against superior numbers. His legacy wasn't just in the tally, but in how he flew and what he represented, a quiet warrior, loyal to his squadron and country, unshaken by the chaos around him. Despite the many kills, the adrenaline, and the accolades, Walsh remained grounded. He rarely gave interviews, and when he did, he spoke modestly of his actions. He was known to deflect praise, often crediting luck, the Corsair, or his wingmen. It was this humility that earned him respect not just from Marines, but from Navy and Army Air Forces personnel who fought beside him. After the war, Walsh remained in the Marine Corps. He continued flying, taking on roles that leveraged his combat experience to train the next generation of naval aviators. He also flew combat missions during the Korean War, once again stepping into danger with the same calm and control that had defined him in the Pacific. Though he would not engage in the same high volume of dogfighting as in World War II, his presence in Korea was a powerful reminder of what combat-hardened experience brought to aerial warfare. As aviation advanced from propeller-driven aircraft to jets, Walsh adapted. His understanding of air combat remained valuable, and he earned respect not just as a pilot, but as a symbol of an era when dogfights were fought with eyesight, grit, and machine guns. His transition to newer aircraft was seamless, though he would always hold a particular fondness for the F-4U Corsair, the machine that had carried him through the deadliest missions of his life. As the war moved on and Allied forces gained momentum in the Pacific, the reputation of Marine aviators like Kenneth Walsh only grew stronger. His 21 aerial victories were more than just a number. They symbolized not only tactical brilliance but also the tenacity required to face wave after wave of seasoned Japanese pilots in the most unforgiving theaters of war. Despite the constant danger, Walsh never allowed complacency to set in. Each mission, no matter how routine, was approached with the same calculated precision and professionalism. That discipline became part of his legend, and the men who flew beside him came to rely on that calm under fire. Flying the Corsair in combat wasn't simply about pointing the aircraft at the enemy and pulling the trigger. It required deep understanding of aerial tactics, superior situational awareness, and physical endurance. The long patrols, the high-G dogfights, the sudden plunges from altitude into enemy formations, all of these taxed even the most experienced pilots. Walsh managed it not only with efficiency but with a kind of quiet aggression that was rare. His energy wasn't loud or boastful, it was focused, simmering just beneath the surface. He had developed a combat rhythm, a series of internal checklists and responses that enabled him to make life-or-death decisions in fractions of a second. He knew when to press the attack and when to break off. He understood that being an ace wasn't about glory, it was about effectiveness. Japanese pilots were still formidable opponents, especially those flying the Mitsubishi A6M0. The Zero had tremendous maneuverability, and in the hands of an experienced pilot, it could turn inside most American aircraft. Walsh knew this and adjusted his tactics accordingly. He never tried to outturn a Zero, instead, he used the Corsair's superior speed in dives and climbs, taking advantage of boom and zoom attacks. There were times when Walsh would deliberately bait enemy fighters, appearing vulnerable or exposed, only to lure them into a trap. One such instance occurred during a patrol near Bougainville, when Walsh flew just slightly behind the formation, enticing two Zeros to break formation and chase him. He waited until they closed in before diving steeply, gaining speed, then pulling a tight climbing turn that placed him behind them. He downed both within seconds. Such maneuvers required nerves of steel, flawless judgment, and an intimate knowledge of both his aircraft and the enemy's. But it wasn't just flying skill that defined Walsh. It was leadership. Even when he wasn't the ranking officer in the air, other pilots often looked to him for cues. In the chaos of battle, when radio communication failed or plans broke apart, Walsh's actions often became the rallying point. If he turned into the fight, the rest followed. If he climbed for altitude, the formation climbed with him. That unspoken command came not from rank, but from trust. Among ground crew and fellow Marines, he was considered approachable and grounded. He often took time to talk to the mechanics who serviced his aircraft, thanking them personally, asking how the machine felt, and discussing adjustments. He knew that his life, and the lives of others, often depended on those men. He never treated them as invisible. In the brutal rhythm of war, those small moments built a foundation of loyalty and respect that few others achieved. Though the headlines often spotlighted the fighter pilots with the highest number of kills, Walsh quietly moved through his missions, avoiding the spotlight. It was only after his Medal of Honor citation that more attention began to follow him, though he often shied away from interviews or public displays. To Walsh, the real heroes were the men who didn't make it back. He kept photographs of fallen friends in a small folder, and from time to time, he would study their faces before a mission, as if drawing strength from their memory. On the few occasions he spoke to younger pilots about combat, he emphasized mental clarity over aggression. He told them that any pilot who fought angry or afraid was already at a disadvantage. Survival depended on staying calm, reading the situation, and never losing sight of the objective. These weren't just platitudes, they were battle-tested truths. During downtime on base, Walsh wasn't a man of excessive recreation. He spent his free time reviewing mission maps, writing letters, or walking along the airstrip as the sun set. Other Marines would sometimes watch him in silence, wondering what ran through the mind of a man who had stared down death so many times. His presence alone could quiet a room, not out of fear, but out of reverence. As the war drew closer to its conclusion, Walsh's role gradually shifted. He was assigned to less frequent combat missions and began working more in training and operational planning. Though he missed the adrenaline of flight, he understood the importance of passing on knowledge. Many of the tactics he had refined in the heat of battle became standard doctrine in Marine fighter training. He contributed detailed debriefs, wrote observations on enemy strategy, and helped shape the future of naval aviation in subtle but lasting ways. In 1944, when he was rotated back to the United States, he had accumulated not only 21 confirmed kills, but also an unmatched respect from his peers. His Medal of Honor was joined by multiple distinguished flying crosses and air medals. These decorations, while proudly earned, were never hung in an ostentatious place in his home. Walsh kept them in a box, along with flight logs, mission notes, and photographs. His memories were not trophies, they were reminders. The transition to post-war life was not without its challenges. Like many veterans, Walsh carried the weight of memory with him. Though he continued to serve in the Marines, the rhythm of civilian life felt strange. There were moments of silence when old gunfire seemed to echo in his mind, and dreams of smoky skies over the Solomons haunted his sleep. He rarely spoke of it, but those close to him noticed. Still, he pressed on, determined to serve wherever he was needed. He remained active in Marine Corps aviation throughout the 1950s, and when the Korean War broke out, he volunteered once again. Though no longer in the same role as during World War II, he flew several support and training missions, helping to bring a new generation of Marines up to speed. His presence alone was a symbol of experience, and younger pilots often asked him questions, eager to learn from someone who had danced with death and returned. When jet aircraft became the norm, Walsh adapted quickly. His deep understanding of flight mechanics, his uncanny ability to anticipate enemy moves, and his passion for aviation made him a natural in transition. Though the speed and technology had evolved, the essence of combat flying remained: know your machine, respect your enemy, and never panic. Years later, as his service wound down, he retired from active duty with the rank of lieutenant colonel. His time in uniform had spanned 3 decades, 2 wars, and countless missions. He had trained dozens of pilots, advised squadrons, and left an indelible mark on Marine Corps aviation. Yet even in retirement, Walsh's legacy didn't fade. Historians and aviation enthusiasts began to take deeper interest in the war's unsung heroes. In books and documentaries, his story began to surface more prominently. Veterans who had flown with him shared stories of his courage, skill, and humility. They spoke of a man who never sought fame but had earned it through sheer excellence and quiet conviction. One particular story, told by a fellow Marine, encapsulated who Walsh was. During a mission in which another pilot had gone missing, Walsh personally led a risky search operation, combing the jungle-covered coastline of Bougainville. Though the pilot had already been presumed lost, Walsh refused to give up. He believed in doing the right thing, even when orders didn't require it. That pilot was found alive and rescued, thanks to Walsh's insistence. As the post-war world settled into a new order, Kenneth Walsh continued to live a quiet, disciplined life. Though decorated and respected, he never sought to elevate himself above others. Instead, he returned to a lifestyle that valued duty, service, and the camaraderie of those who had shared the same airspace, the same risks, and the same burden. He moved with a natural humility, and when strangers eventually learned of his wartime heroics, they were often stunned that such a calm, gentle figure could have been one of the deadliest pilots in the Pacific. His impact extended far beyond the tally of his kills. In aviation circles, Walsh was seen as the embodiment of the disciplined combat pilot, a man who never let adrenaline override his judgment. He was part of the rare group of Marine aviators whose experience directly influenced the evolution of aerial combat training in the United States. His reports were not academic. They came from the front lines, from cockpit canopy to gunsight, and they helped shape how the next generation of pilots would fly and fight. During the 1950s, as aviation rapidly evolved, Walsh maintained close ties with military flight programs. Though no longer at the forefront of aerial duels, he remained respected as an instructor, evaluator, and consultant. His knowledge of enemy behavior, flight tactics, and mechanical performance made him a valuable asset in both jet and propeller aircraft development discussions. He was invited to speak at training camps, tactical symposiums, and historical briefings. But every appearance followed the same pattern: no showmanship, no grand stories. He was direct, technical, and always credited teamwork over personal valor. When asked about his most difficult missions, Walsh would often pause, reflect, and then shift the conversation. It wasn't avoidance. It was reverence. Many of those missions involved close friends who didn't return. To relive them was to feel the loss again. And yet, through quiet conversations with fellow veterans, the full depth of his experiences continued to emerge over time. He spoke of the weightlessness that followed a kill, the surreal silence that replaced the chaos of gunfire once the enemy aircraft spiraled away, and the sudden return of fear when searching the sky for the next threat. His recollections were not of triumph, but of consequence. Despite his combat record, Walsh was deeply respectful of the enemy. He never spoke with hatred or contempt of the Japanese pilots he had fought. Instead, he viewed them as worthy adversaries, skilled, brave, and committed. He understood the strange bond that combat sometimes created between foes. More than once, he had described the eerie beauty of a dogfight, the flashes of metal, the sharp turns in the sky, the thundering engines, and the moment when time seemed to stretch as one pilot outmaneuvered the other. These were moments few could understand, but for Walsh, they were as vivid decades later as the day they occurred. His Corsair had become more than a machine. It was a memory, a living echo of every battle he had survived. Though many of the original planes were retired, scrapped, or lost, Walsh always lit up when he saw one in a museum or airshow. On one occasion, he was invited to sit in the cockpit of a restored F-4U. Though older and slower in his movements, he climbed in, adjusted the seat, and ran his hands over the controls like an old ritual. A small crowd watched in silence as he closed his eyes and smiled. For that moment, he was back in the Solomons, flying through flak and tracer rounds, eyes locked on a distant silhouette. In interviews, his Medal of Honor was often brought up. But Walsh was quick to point out that many others had done more, or suffered more. He considered the medal a recognition of all the Marines he had flown with, many of whom had no medals at all. He once told a group of young aviators that the true honor was not in awards, but in the mission, doing your job, keeping your team alive, and returning to fly again. He also spoke of fear. Unlike the myth of the fearless ace, Walsh admitted that fear was ever present. The difference, he said, was learning how to master it. Before each mission, he would walk the flight line alone, checking the weather, reviewing the route, and running scenarios in his mind. He believed that preparation, not bravery, was what made a pilot effective. Once in the air, he entered a state of concentration so deep that fear faded. Only when back on the ground did the weight of what had happened truly settle in. In later years, as veterans of the Pacific Theater gathered for reunions and commemorations, Walsh became a central figure. Younger Marines were drawn to him, eager to hear firsthand what it was like to fight above the jungles and oceans of World War II. He would sit quietly for hours, answering every question, sharing what he could, and always reminding listeners that war was never something to be romanticized. It was brutal, unforgiving, and filled with irreversible moments. One of his most poignant reflections came during a private conversation at a Marine Corps event. He spoke of a Japanese pilot he had shot down over Bougainville. As he flew past the wreckage, he saw the enemy pilot parachuting into the jungle. For years afterward, Walsh said he sometimes thought of that man, what his name was, whether he survived, and what he might have told his family. These were not thoughts of guilt, but of humanity. Walsh understood that behind every uniform was a son, a brother, a man who believed he was doing what was right. War stripped away such distinctions, but Walsh, even after all he had seen, never allowed himself to forget them. In his final years, Walsh was recognized with numerous honors. He was inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame and was frequently invited to military academies and aviation institutions as a guest of honor. Each ceremony, each handshake, was accepted with quiet gratitude. But he always deflected the spotlight back to others, the ground crews, the wingmen, the fallen. Despite all his accomplishments, he never wrote a memoir. When asked why, he said simply that those who needed to know already knew, and those who wanted to understand could find it in the faces of the men who had flown beside him. He felt that his legacy wasn't in words on a page, but in the air above the Pacific, in the roar of a Corsair engine, and in the calm voice of a flight leader guiding his men through fire. His death in 1998 marked the passing of one of the most revered figures in Marine Corps aviation history. He was buried with full military honors, and across the country, squadrons and aviation units held moments of silence. In schools, flight simulators, and historical exhibits, his name appeared not as a symbol of destruction, but as an example of discipline, courage, and clarity in chaos. For those who study his missions, who examine the flight logs and aerial maps, there is a pattern of relentless pursuit, not of glory, but of purpose. Walsh didn't fight for headlines or fame. He flew to protect his brothers, to serve his country, and to finish each mission with honor. His life, from the early days as a mechanic to the skies over Bougainville, stands as a timeless reminder that real heroes are often the ones who never seek the title. Long after the Pacific War had ended and decades after jets replaced the propeller-driven beasts of the Second World War, the legacy of Kenneth Walsh remained deeply woven into the identity of the Marine Corps. Though he never spoke of himself as a legend, those who served with him or studied his missions held no doubt that he represented the best of what a combat pilot could be. He was not only a fighter ace, he was a symbol of the rare fusion of skill, humility, and resolve that defined a generation. In the years that followed his retirement, aviation historians began to reconstruct his story in full. They pored over combat reports, squadron logs, and first-hand accounts. They interviewed the few surviving pilots who had flown wingtip to wingtip with him over the Solomon Islands. What emerged was not just the record of 21 aerial victories, but a pattern of extraordinary consistency under pressure. Kenneth Walsh had flown more than 100 combat missions in the F-4U Corsair, and in nearly every one, he had demonstrated leadership, calm, and a deep understanding of air combat that couldn't be taught in manuals. He was a man who had no need to exaggerate, and because of that, the details others shared about him carried even more weight. One such account described how, after returning from a particularly brutal engagement in which his aircraft had taken severe damage, he landed with only partial control and smoke trailing from the engine. When the mechanics rushed to help him from the cockpit, he waved them off, climbed out, and simply asked how the rest of the squadron had fared. It wasn't about him. It never had been. That quiet leadership, always present but never declared, inspired countless pilots who came after. His tactics became the foundation for training materials, and some of his personal advice to young pilots found its way into aviation manuals and classroom lectures. He didn't invent new maneuvers, but he perfected what worked and taught others to rely on discipline over daring. One of his most repeated principles was simple: live to fly again. For Walsh, survival wasn't luck, it was the result of preparation, patience, and composure. His story became especially powerful in the age of rapid technological progress, where pilots began to rely increasingly on systems, electronics, and radar-guided weapons. In Walsh's time, a pilot had only his eyes, his instincts, and a stick in his hands. He had no radar to track the enemy, no heat-seeking missiles, and no automatic targeting systems. Every decision had to be made in real time, with limited information and under extreme physical strain. And yet he had survived, prevailed, and brought others home. For younger generations trying to understand the human cost and character of the Second World War, Walsh offered a rare window. He wasn't a figure of propaganda or a caricature of valor, he was real. A man who had grown up in Brooklyn, joined the Marines, and fought in the most dangerous skies on earth, not for medals or fame, but because it was the right thing to do. When he spoke to students or at aviation events, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had lived every word. Even into his later years, Walsh was active in veterans' causes and memorial efforts. He attended reunions, visited Marine bases, and participated in ceremonies honoring fallen aviators. At each one, his presence was felt with a kind of reverence. Not because he demanded it, but because those around him knew what he had done. When asked what it felt like to be remembered as a hero, he once answered that he didn't feel like one. "I was a Marine. I did my job. That was enough." That simple response, repeated in various interviews and events, captured the essence of his legacy. He didn't view heroism as something that set him apart. He believed it was a byproduct of responsibility, of showing up, staying calm, and never giving up. He believed that every man who flew, fought, and stood his ground deserved equal credit. His humility made his accomplishments even more powerful. One of the most striking aspects of Walsh's legacy is that he was one of the very few enlisted men to receive the Medal of Honor as a pilot. Before being commissioned as an officer, Walsh flew many of his missions while still a technical sergeant. His rise from enlisted mechanic to fighter ace underscored a Marine Corps tradition that valued performance over pedigree. He had proven that skill, courage, and leadership weren't limited to the officer class, they could be found in any man willing to step forward. In the final years of his life, Walsh began to speak more openly about his memories, though always in a soft, measured tone. He would reflect on the smell of the jungle air over the islands, the sudden glare of sunlight off an enemy canopy, and the strange silence that fell over the cockpit after a successful mission. He remembered the sounds of the Corsair's engine, the tight feel of the throttle in his palm, and the thud of machine guns shaking the wings. These memories, he said, never truly faded. He also spoke of the cost of war, the friends who didn't return, the families left waiting, the men who were lost not just to combat but to the pain that followed. Walsh never glorified battle. Instead, he honored sacrifice. In his eyes, the true weight of victory was measured not by territory gained, but by lives preserved and remembered. When Kenneth Walsh passed away on July 30, 1998, he was 81 years old. His funeral, attended by Marines, aviators, historians, and family, was held with full military honors. As the rifle volleys rang out and taps echoed across the cemetery, a formation of aircraft flew overhead in the missing man formation. A single Corsair replica led the group, banking away in silence, symbolizing the departure of a warrior who had shaped history. Today, his name is inscribed in Marine Corps history, his face remembered in aviation halls, and his example taught in classrooms across the country. But perhaps the most enduring tribute to Kenneth Walsh lives not in museums or books, but in the skies themselves, in the invisible trail left behind by a man who flew with unmatched skill, unwavering duty, and quiet grace. He left behind no speeches, no memoirs, and no dramatic accounts. Just a record of 21 victories, dozens of saved lives, and a reputation built on excellence, humility, and resolve. In an age where legends are often exaggerated, Kenneth Walsh stood as one of the few who never needed embellishment. His actions spoke louder than any words could. And for those who ask how one man could achieve so much in so few years, the answer is simple. He flew. He fought. He led. And when the skies were darkest, he was there, calm, focused, and unbreakable. A Marine. A pilot. A man who made history, not with grand gestures, but with every mission, every choice, and every flight that took him deeper into danger and closer to the edge of human courage.